It does seem to me suspicious, for example, that the Gospel of Mark, which is the earliest Gospel, contains no post-resurrection appearances. And then the Gospel of Matthew does include post-resurrection appearances. The Gospel of Luke includes even more. It's only in the Gospel of John that we get, for instance, Doubting Thomas, which is the latest Gospel, canonical Gospel, I should say. That's where that arises. And in fact, the story of Doubting Thomas, famously, he doesn't believe that it's the risen Christ. And Jesus says, "Come and touch my wounds." And he touches his wounds and he says, "My Lord and my God." And Jesus says, "You believe because you've seen. Blessed are those who believe without seeing." So in my view, what we have is this so-called mythological development of no post-resurrection appearances. And as the time goes on, as we get further away from the source, the stories get more fantastical, ending in a moral lesson to believe without evidence. Seeing. Yes. This to me does seem a little bit suspicious.
Alex O'Connor is one of the most interesting and thoughtful atheists on the internet. I always enjoy watching his stuff. Now, while I've learned a lot from watching his videos, I think there are two significant problems with what you just heard. First, the idea that resurrection appearances are merely the product of mythological development over time is significantly undermined by an early creed found in 1 Corinthians 15. While 1 Corinthians was written probably early 50s, which predates Mark's gospel, it contains an early oral creed that likely goes back to within 5 years of the death of Jesus. This oral creed says this: that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. Granted, these appearances read more like a shopping list than elaborate stories, but my point is, we get 5 different appearances, plus Paul, recorded before Mark ever writes his gospel. And one of those appearances evidently was to more than 500 people at one time. That sounds pretty fantastical to use Alex's language, yet it's closer to the alleged events than any of the gospels. This historical fact does not fit well with the idea that the resurrection appearances are the result of mythological development over time as you move further away from the source. So that's the first problem. Here's the second problem. Alex is wrong about the moral lesson in John's gospel. Alex says John's gospel culminates with the story of doubting Thomas to communicate the moral lesson to believe without evidence. However, that's not what this account is about. Most people stop reading at verse 29, but the next 2 verses are crucial in understanding how John understands the relationship between evidence and belief. Jesus just finished saying, "Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe." Then John immediately comments, "Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." This passage isn't against evidence for faith. In fact, this passage is part of the evidence for faith. There are those like Thomas who saw the risen Jesus and believed. But that's not most of us, and John knows that. That's why he includes this account in his gospel. We don't get to see the evidence and believe. Rather, we get to read the evidence and believe. But make no mistake, both rest on a firm foundation of the evidence. It's ironic that people pick the story of doubting Thomas to show that evidence and belief are at odds, since John includes the story for one simple reason: to provide evidence for belief. As John puts it, these are written so that you would believe.